Thank you, Juan. Thank you, Wojciech, for the excellent introduction. And thanks, DG MARE and UNESCO for giving me the opportunity to present the results of this study. I had the pleasure to work on together with a team made up of Cogea, the lead company, but also SETMA from Spain, Poseidon from the UK, Seascape Belgium, from Belgium, and the University of Vigo from Spain. And also special thanks to Professor Karin Morrissey from the University of Exeter, UK, for coordinating the peer review work on the study that Wojciech mentioned. It was really an important step in our study. I must say that working on this study was an amazing journey for me personally. I think I'm speaking on behalf of the team. And of course, it's not easy to condense 300-page report into a 20 minutes presentation, but fortunately, we also wrote an abridged non-technical version of the study, so I'll try and do my best. And without further ado, so please let's see the first slide of my presentation. So why a study on the economic impact of MSP in the first place? I think Wojciech summed it up pretty well. Let me just say, add that MSP has been studied for a very long time now, and there's a wealth of projects and studies that make sound arguments for establishing it. But most of these studies have focused on why MSP is important and what benefits it might produce if it's implemented. On the other hand, very few studies have had a look at the economics of MSP to gauge its impact on the blue economy after MSP has actually been implemented. So there was a knowledge void, and that's a long story short why the EU Commission needed this study. We all know that there's a deadline in March 2021 for the EU member states to establish their plans. And so we hope that the knowledge gathered through this study may be of some help in this process. Next slide, please. So I just want to tell you about how we managed to measure the economic impact of MSP. Now, economists care a lot about methods. Human beings, not so much maybe. So I'll just say a few words about what we did and how we did it. And I know that methods are boring, but they're also very, very important. When you work at macro level, as we did, even a tiny difference between two methods might produce entirely different results. So it's very, very important to be fully transparent. And that's why there's an extended version of the study, which includes all the spreadsheets we use for our calculations. So for now, for the time being, let's just quickly go through the method we used. And the first thing we did was, of course, to look at what the economic literature says about MSP. We then compared the pros and cons of each method surveyed in literature. And we soon realized that there were some knowledge and data gaps. So we had to also figure out a way to bridge these gaps before we could move on. Then we moved on to carry out some case studies. As Wojciech mentioned, we selected 5 case studies: Belgium, Germany, Baltic Sea, Scotland, Norway, only the North Sea and Skagerrak region, and Rhode Island in the US. So in these 5 countries or regions, we measured the performance of the blue economy after the implementation of MSP. At the same time, we also developed alternative scenarios. So we compared each of these countries to a set of neighboring countries without MSP. And we assumed that had MSP not been implemented in the 5 case studies countries, their blue economy would have evolved at a pace similar to that of the set of neighboring countries. So we built a so-called counterfactual scenario, a fiction of truth actually. So we compared the reality of the blue economy in these countries after MSP with our counterfactual scenario, and the difference between these 2 scenarios, we assumed it to be the direct impact of MSP, barring all other things being equal, of course. And after calculating direct impact of MSP, we also went on to calculate the indirect impact of MSP on the rest of the economy. So next slide, please. Now, these are the results of the study in a nutshell. In 3 out of 5 case studies, there is Belgium, Germany, and that flag, though nobody's seen before, is Rhode Island. MSP has generated substantive total economic benefits. In Scotland, the data available, the statistical data we had covered just 1 year after the entry into force of MSP, so its effects couldn't possibly show up in the data. However, stakeholders are very optimistic about the effects of the plan, that we're confident that they will eventually show up in the data as well. They probably already are, because we carried out the case studies a few months ago now. And in Norway, Norway is the only country where the impact of MSP was negative. However, this was entirely due to the terrible performance of the oil and gas industry, whose resources are depleting in the North Sea. And that industry is so big in Norway that it dragged down the entire blue economy. And in fact, if you just remove oil and gas from our calculations, the impact of MSP in Norway is actually positive. Although, to be fair, I must say that it's negligible, so not a big impact after all. Next slide, please. Now, a quick look at the numbers. The graphs here show the additional production value added, and employment generated by MSP in Belgium, Baltic, Germany, and Rhode Island. And that is, we estimate that without MSP, this additional impact wouldn't have materialized. So we see in the top left corner, Belgium, we see that MSP generated an extra 350 million euro of additional value added and nearly 900 additional employees, and that was 2015 alone. And in Baltic Germany, the figures you can see are even higher. But I mean, you have the full version of the report to play with numbers. I don't want to bother you with crude numbers right now. You can have a look at this slide. I'd just like you to focus on 2 things for the purpose of this presentation. First thing is, what you're seeing here is the total impact, which means direct, indirect, and induced impact. Now, direct impact is the impact of MSP on the blue economy sectors directly affected by MSP. Then, of course, the sectors the companies in these sectors purchase services and goods from other non-maritime sectors of the economy. And that is what we call the indirect impact of MSP. And finally, the people directly and indirectly employed by MSP, of course, they gain additional income by working in the industry, and that income is spent in their households for a variety of purposes, and that is what is called the induced impact of MSP. Now, this is a multiplier effect. There's a policy change, and then it reverberates through other sectors of the economy. And that's exactly how the economy grows. But of course, if you just look at only the direct impact, that is alone, it's much, much smaller. Those are the aggregated figures, the total impact on the economy. The other thing I would like you to be focusing on right now is that if you look at the curves both in Belgium and Germany, you see that the impact of MSP is negligible or not so evident in the early days of the plan. Then it peaks, and then again, it seems like it's petering out. And we believe this is a common pattern. You don't get to see it in Rhode Island because they haven't reached the peak yet. And note again that what you're seeing is only the additional impact of MSP. So even if it gets to 0, it doesn't mean that the blue economy has stopped growing. It just means that MSP has finished boosting it further. So now maybe it's too soon to say, but we believe that the downward trend you get to see at a certain point is natural and inevitable. You set it up, you adopt the plan, and so MSP starts producing its effects. Then it accelerates certain processes, It boosts the blue economy, then of course its impact slowly reduces as things go back to normal and we see a regression to the mean. But in the meantime, it has generated a lot of additional growth and employment. And you can also see in the bottom right corner what the stakeholders we interviewed think about MSP. And we can see that majority believes that it improved investment in business expectations. Unlike what we expected, most of them don't think that MSP reduced transaction costs, but a vast majority believes they improved access to information. There's a mixed opinion on cross-border relations. In the case studies countries, it seems that these weren't affected, at least in the words of stakeholder. But anyway, everybody visually agrees that it improved conflict resolution, and overall it had positive effects on their sector. Next slide, please. So the type of benefits that MSP produces, just a quick overview. We already talked about direct, indirect, and induced benefits. Now there's also increased stability and certainty, which in turn are a driver for economic growth. We have increased data availability, and you might be wondering, what's that got to do with economic growth? Except it does have something to do with economic growth, because more data leads to increased certainty and lower costs for companies in the blue economy. We also have conflict resolution, which, well, I guess that's pretty obvious, doesn't come as a surprise, certainly. And we also have reduced administrative burden. And now that is particularly interesting, so we'll go over it again in a few slides. I'll just want to show some hands-on examples from the study of these benefits from the study. So next slide, please. So a stable framework accelerated high-risk investments for offshore wind developers in Belgium, Germany, and Rhode Island. Accelerated high-risk investments. That's not an economy speculation. That's what real people from industry told us during the study. Next, please. Now, what you're seeing here is a screenshot from the NMPI, and NMPI stands for National Marine Plan Interactive, which is a data portal implemented by Marine Scotland in the framework of their maritime spatial planning process. The portal offers a wealth of marine data, and is a spillover effect. We can call it a spillover effect of an MSP process. And I dare say that this specific portal is universally acknowledged as a best practice. Now, this also translates in the long run into economic benefits. Next slide, please. Now we have reduced administrative burden, and I told you this was going to be interesting, but why? Contrary to, I'd say, the conventional wisdom on MSP, from our case studies, we don't have overwhelming evidence that MSP benefits economic growth by reducing administrative burden or cutting red tape. Most stakeholders said that, yes, some costs and some red tape were cut, but some others actually increased, and these two effects eventually cancel each other out. So in the end, there are no real savings. That's the opinion of the majority of stakeholders interviewed. But there is one important exception. The picture you've seen in the background is the Block Island wind farm off the coast of Rhode Island in the US. And this is the first offshore wind farm ever built in America. And this was built in the framework of Rhode Island Maritime Spatial Planning process. Now, let's compare this picture, this wind farm you're seeing, with another wind project in the US. It's the Cape Wind project in Massachusetts. Cape Wind wasn't framed in a spatial plan. And it started far earlier than Block Island in Rhode Island, but it faced local opposition and a set of legislative setbacks. It took 15 years to get approved, and several $1 million were spent on compliance studies, on processes, and eventually the developer got the approval, but in the meantime, their lease rights had expired. So at the end of the day, Cape Wind was never built, and today the energy it's producing, of course, is zero, zilch, nothing, because it doesn't exist. Block Island, Rhode Island, on the other hand, it was framed into MSP, it got pre-approval, it got approved in just 1 year, and until last year, it had an expected revenue of $100 million a year. So what is this exception? This exception is fast tracking. MSP, and this is why we didn't find this in the study, MSP does not reduce red tape by definition, but it can do that by design. And in Rhode Island, the planners and the local authorities resolved to cut red tape for the wind energy sectors, and they did so, and the difference is now stark when you compare it with the Cape Wind project in Massachusetts. So you can do it, even though the vast majority of stakeholders we interviewed don't agree on that. Next slide, please. So, who reaps most benefits? This is a question I heard a lot while I was working on the study. Both from our case studies and from literature, it seems that emerging sectors seem to be benefiting the most from MSP, whereas traditional sectors often claim to be neglected by the MSP process. There's also a handbook conflict between offshore wind developers and fishers. But the real question is not who reaps most benefits, is why does this happen, this conflict between emerging sectors and traditional sectors. And of course, it's not something written in stone. Let's be clear. It's often is, I dare say, it always is a policy choice. Emerging sectors are often also perceived as environmentally friendly. Clean energy, for instance, helps policymakers achieve the emission reduction targets. And also, clean energy is still relatively new. How many wind farms were there 20 years ago? Oh, how about 10 years ago? So the ocean might seem endless, but in fact, it's a scarce resource, and space is in high demand. So if you open it up to a new use, generally speaking, there will be less space left for the incumbent sectors. But it always is a policy choice. In principle, nothing would prevent a country from favoring traditional sectors over emerging industries. So the real answer is on next slide, please. The real answer is that if one accepts the principle that ocean space may be opened up to new uses, it's true that these new uses might subtract space previously used by incumbent industries, but it is equally true that without planning, consultation and negotiation, the loss of space might be even more harmful. So bottom line is, in the example I just gave you, either we build wind farms or we don't. And if we do build wind farms, if we get to build them, then the conclusions of the study is that it's better to do it in the framework of a plan. Now, see the picture on the left. Here, a wind farm gets built without planning, and it gets built on a fishing ground. So fishing boats, of course, can't sail there, so they don't get to fish at all. You can see the fish is still swimming, and the fishing boats just can't get there. In the picture on the right, on the other hand, the wind farms gets built anyway, but because there's a planning process, there is a negotiation process, a consultation process, it gets built elsewhere. So at the end of the day, there still is less space for our fishing boats, but at least she doesn't get to lose access to that precious and productive fishing ground. And you can see that the boat is enjoying the bonanza of fish that the ocean has to offer. So yes, it's true that some sectors might feel that they have less space for them, but if you use MSP, probably with more and more uses of the ocean that we can envisage in the future, the losses can be limited through MSP. Next slide, please. And even if we accept the principle, however, it's still important for a planning authority to win stakeholders' buy-in, so to maximize the economic benefits from MSP. And how can they do that? First option, they can explore multi-use of marine space. I say the general rule is that a new use of the ocean implies less space for other uses. This is true, but there are exceptions. Some activities may be co-located in the same area. There was a beautiful project about that in Europe. It's called Muses. I encourage you to go and have a look at that. Then it's of course important to involve stakeholders in consultation from the outset of the process. Ideally, you might want to create a shared vision that something is going to happen. And finally, when things get rough, another option is to negotiate compensation packages. The new sectors, in principle, might compensate the existing ones for expected or actual losses. Now, you can pay these packages out of taxpayers' money. That's what they did with fishers in Australia. Or you can have the new sectors pay the packages themselves, provided, of course, that their profits exceed the expense. And this is the approach pursued in Rhode Island, where wind farm developers, in the framework of the negotiation and consultation process, agreed to compensate fishers for expected losses. Next slide, please. So that's it. Just two more things. First, you see that there's thank you in a lot of languages. Please check carefully if your language is there, because if it's not there, you're entitled to a refund of your webinar fee. And then in the top right corner, you'll see a QR code. So take your smartphone, turn the camera on, scan the QR code. It'll get you to a link to download the abridged version of the study. Read it. I promise it's worth it. You won't regret it. Thank you very much.